probably dribbling in over the next 15 minutes or so. My name's Lee Travascus. I'm the principal here at Trinity College. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. Welcome to our first Trinity Unplugged. Now, Trinity Unplugged is sort of a selfish initiative. It reflects what I wish I would punctuate my life of faith a little more regularly, being able to listen to some intellectuals sort of bring the Christian or the historical Christian tradition alongside some of the challenges we can face living as Christians in modern society. Tonight we've got Scott Stevens from the ABC Religion and Ethics, or the Religion and Ethics commentator is what I call you, isn't it, Scott? Something like that. Scott actually used to lecture here at Trinity College years ago, didn't you? It wouldn't have been that long ago. Did some lecturing. And we've got Ben Myers here, who is a theologian from the Uniting Theological College in Sydney, but is from Queensland himself. Yeah, we've got a commentator on the side here. Thanks. The other purpose of these evenings is starting to profile what's happening here at Trinity College. So I've been here about 5 months, and we're in the process of radical change, where we're trying to build a college that I hope will facilitate the emergence of people like Ben and Scott, people who will be the next generation of leaders in the church, who can, I guess, selfishly again, that when I turn up and meet with a Christian group, that I'm not going to be bored, but that I'll feel engaged and that it was a valuable use of my time, encouraged, something that's also good for my children. So the college is about to appoint a whole lot of new faculty heading into next year, and we're appointing faculty who are going to model how to, well, I've characterised it today in something I sent out as produce people like David Attenborough. When it comes to David Attenborough and a garden skink, I mean, you and I pass the skink and we think nothing of it. That guy can make the thing sound interesting for a whole hour. And I guess I think it'd be wonderful if we can produce people who are expert at reading the biblical text, take this ancient text, and demonstrate how it moves like an animal, bring it to life, and bring it alongside the challenges that we do face in this society. You'll notice at the moment the college is just on this level. It's hard to see what's going on around you, and there will be massive changes. I think massive, but a few walls knocked down toward the end of the year. The last thing before I introduce ask Scott and Ben to take over for the evening is you'll notice on your chairs there is a flyer for what's called Trinity Unchained. So it's Trinity Unplugged. That's, as someone called it, I think, the acoustic sort of experience of bringing these experts alongside the garden variety problems we face. Trinity Unchained will be a little bigger than this. It'll be larger venues. So this one's at Calvary Christian College, a 700-seat auditorium. And Melinda Tankard-Rice, who you may have seen on things like Q&A or writing in, I think, Fairfax, is going to speak both with people from high school age and to adults, youth leaders, grandparents, about the challenges of pornification, how to grow up children who are trying to navigate a sexed up world. I'd really appreciate it if you could promote this in your local church. So if you want to grab a few of these as you leave, there's a whole lot out on the counter. So I'm going to ask Ben and Scott, we'll do this in the unplugged way, very little sort of hoo-ha. We're just going to get them up and they're going to sit out here and start addressing this topic of the challenges of discipleship in a media-saturated age. Thank you, Scott and Ben.
Thanks, Lee.
All right. Thank you. Well, I think it actually says just about everything you need to know that Ben's on the left, or, you know. No. Anyway, I'm going to stop there because it's reversed now. Well, no, but yeah, I'm not going to be tempted. No. Look, just a couple very, very quick words by way of preface. Firstly, it's a great pleasure to be here with you all. It's a great pleasure to be here with one of my oldest and dearest friends. Ben is, you couldn't invent him if he didn't exist, and I'll try to demonstrate tonight why that's the case. I should also say, if you've not ever heard Melinda Tankard-Reist before, she really is something else. She's another very, very, very dear friend. I should say she writes a regular column for ABC Religion and Ethics. In fact, one of the biggest pieces that we've ever had in terms of ongoing and international traffic was a piece that she wrote on why young girls are sick and tired of porn-saturated boys. It was a masterpiece of moral reflection and diagnosis on a different kind of saturation of the modern age. She is out of this world and someone with a tremendous amount of both skin in this game. She's lost a tremendous amount personally by doing what she's doing. You've not seen litigiousness until you've gone up against the porn lobby. Let me just leave it at that. And look, again, she's someone you couldn't invent if she didn't exist. She has a very rare and a very wonderful charism. I actually wasn't entirely sure what we were doing tonight. I kind of thought that maybe I was supposed to be interviewing Ben, but then I kind of thought we're not really supposed to be... Well, it didn't make sense to me until I thought, well, hang on, this is kind of like a live minefield, isn't it? I mean, this is actually what we're doing. So hopefully we've got a common topic. We've got a lot more than 25 minutes, which is luxury. And it's something that we've both, I think, thought from very, very, very different perspectives and with different philosophical, theological resources, I think, to bear. We've brought them to bear in a very different way. And it's been fascinating. I mean, Ben and I talk about this sort of stuff all the time, but over the last few days is the first time we've ever really, so what do you think about this? How am I different from that? So hopefully you'll benefit from our clarity. If not...
You can be the clear one.
Yeah, okay. If not, to be perfectly frank, screw you all. It's just going to be wonderful being able to talk about this with Ben, so you can listen in. Look, the first thing which you all may not realize, but Ben Myers is actually one of the pioneers of, I'm hesitant to call it online theology, but it's theology in an audience that's not controlled, that is unimaginably larger than a parish congregation. But one of the things that's always struck me about what Ben has done through his world-famous blog, Faith and Theology, is it's public theology. I don't like the term public theology because there isn't any theology that isn't public, it seems to me. But Ben, you've been writing about theology in a way that's refused the temptation to dumb down or to scrub your language clean of anything that might exclude or that might rub people the wrong way. I'm just wondering, I mean, did you, first of all, how did Faith and Theology start? Did you know what you were doing when you started it? Or, I mean, have you thought about theological method in that kind of online space?
Yeah, so, by the way, I can't help thinking of the crushing sense of disappointment if you set this up to be sort of like the minefield. Well, one of the minefield hosts is with you tonight. Unfortunately, I'm the other one. So blogging is no longer a big deal. You know, it had its big heyday. Now Facebook and Twitter are the sort of social media instruments of choice.
The new dark ages, as some of us call it.
The new dark ages. And I don't know why I have still kept blogging all these years. Certainly for myself, because I enjoy the discipline of trying to use language in non-cliched ways to talk about what it is like to be living the Christian life over time. One of the things that impresses me about blogs, though, is the fact that they've declined. So there was a time, it was like there was MySpace, if you remember that. Everyone had one. Thank God they've all gone. Then there were blogs. Everyone had one. And because it's not trendy anymore, because it's not particularly exciting to start a blog anymore, the ones that have survived are often, I enjoy reading blogs because it's often written by people who don't have any particular vested interest. They're not trying to win you over to their point of view. They've simply, over a large period of time, a community of friends have formed around particular blogs, and they are writing within those friendly communities. And some of the best commentary you can find on certain issues you find on blogs. I won't say mine is in that category, but one of the one of the things I've appreciated about blogging is the way trying to put faith into words can form friendships, the way trying to put faith into words can be a process itself of discipleship and exploration. It's not as if you sit down already knowing what you think about a given topic or a given experience, but as you start with some hesitant intuitions and then try to find words to explore those intuitions, you can achieve a clarity that you didn't have before. And there are people trying to do this all over the world, and so you can form unlikely friendships with people who are... One way of exploring their faith is through writing and through reading and through reflecting on the Christian life.
I mean, the way you just described it, though, this is what any friendship is actually like. I mean, the idea that words are simply self-expressive, that whatever it is on the inside, I just want to have the opportunity. So much of when we talk about sort of free speech debate today, the idea is almost that people just have this stuff on the inside and they just need to be given the freedom to let it out. Language is never like that.
Yeah, I don't know.
I mean, it's never... Well, no. So the way that you're describing it is what goes on in any real friendship, which is you first try to tentatively, hesitantly, gropingly put things into expression in the full belief, in the full hope that your friend is going to come back to you and chasten it, prune it, knock the edges off it. So, I mean, what's always been quite charming to me about faith and theology, for instance, is that it's not just a whole lot of anonymous commenters. It's not this, I'm going to avoid using the usual expletives that I use when it comes to comment threads, but, this hurricane of...
It's not the people who do it on ABC Religion.
This, which we've now lost comments. After 5 years of campaigning, I've now had comments deleted from the pages. My life has been worth... Anyway.
That's a giant leap for mankind. Yeah.
But no, instead of this wall of urine and crap, at the end of a piece, not only do you know the people who are commenting, but there's also a kind of genuine accountability which allows you to be tentative, experimental, to subject yourself to the conversation that's bound to follow. And I just wonder, it feels to me with the space that we're in at the moment online, there are far more avenues out there for free and unregulated and I think ill-disciplined expression. That's what Twitter basically is. It's illdisciplinedexpression.com. It's whatever you feel at that particular moment, simply emoted. But at the same time, as our language has become increasingly free to be able to express, the consequences for those expressions are almost unimaginably permanent. So that you can no longer have those safe experimental spaces to be able to say, well, this is kind of what I'm thinking, but who knows? And if you even just think about many newspaper columns today, which really are just glorified tweets. I mean, they're a half-expressed, half-thought-through idea at 800 words. These things suddenly achieve a permanence where this person is going to be either hung for it or remembered for it or renowned for it forever. And I mean, one of the things that I'm worried about, especially in the interests of kind of Christian theology and sort of expression in these places, finding better ways of formulating old things, is that safe places of regulated friendship and discipline are rapidly evaporating as our language is expected to be more permanent, I think, than it was ever meant to be.
Well, I see what you mean about the permanence, but isn't it also partly to do with, I think anonymity has something to do with it as well. If one, let's say, for example, a newspaper piece or a column, if it's addressed in general to the world, to as many readers as you can possibly get, that I think is a different way of that places different conditions on what a person's going to say. And self-expression fits well with that because, for example, if I'm addressing humanity at large, I might try to express myself just to kind of put myself out there in the rawest sort of way. But if I'm talking to you, if we're sitting down together talking, already the fact that we have a history together, the fact that there's certain things you know about me, there's certain things that can be taken for granted that don't have to be said, places totally different constraints around the way I'm going to try to to use language and the types of things I'll be able to say. But I agree with you about the importance of experimentation, so much Christian, because I study and teach the Christian tradition, so much of the most interesting Christian writing is profoundly experimental. My favorite Christian theology book, Augustine's Confessions, it's not because it's the only one I've read. That is just to me an inexhaustible book. Even in its problems, it's so wonderfully problematic. It's so uniquely bad when it's bad, and so uniquely good and rich when it's rich. But the entire genre was made up, a kind of experiment, telling his life story as a prayer to God. Some of the strange ways that Christians have tried to use language to not because they already knew what they wanted to say, and definitely not because they had some kind of raw emotion which they wanted to express to other people, as if language were a way of imprinting my emotions onto you. Not that, but because the Christian tradition is a tradition that draws, its roots lie in texts, in ancient texts about God's way with Israel and in the person of Jesus. And something about the fact that the Christian faith has arisen within a context of the study of language and reflection on language means, I think, that somehow it's always been part of the Christian tradition to actually live the Christian life by writing, to live the Christian life by reading, and so that this is almost the extreme opposite of propagandistic type. I already know what's right and I'm going to tell you. But language as a constant tentative exploration as you try to find your way somehow into all that it means to be a follower of Jesus.
This already raises, though, so many interesting questions for me. Look, to start with, I want to sort of bookmark.
By the way, I just want to say, even Twitter could be used to facilitate.
Yes,
that.
I agree.
I don't think it's
even Twitter.
Even Twitter. It's not as if there are some. I think that's one of the lessons of Christian history. There's no particular form or genre of expression which is either alien to or uniquely suited to the gospel. It's more about the Christian imagination that comes to bear on these different.
Yes, but I would call BS on this idea that you often hear. It's one of these little slogans that I would gladly die in the ditch opposing. This idea that if Jesus were alive today, he would be on Facebook or he would be using Twitter. That Twitter is the new I'm sorry. I haven't got a rich enough vocabulary of certain words to be able to say why that's nonsense. I want to come back to that in a second. I'm not going to be drawn by you, but
I haven't heard it before, and I wondered why. Is it because you get more followers?
Well, yes. That Jesus would have gone. That Jesus. Was that a joke? I didn't get the joke.
No.
Okay.
No. I mean,
That Jesus would have gone to where the crowds are.
Yeah.
That Jesus would have gone to where the crowds are, and that in some ways the medium itself is at best neutral, or it can be kind of skewed towards the good. And at worst, there might be a few kind of limitations like brevity that can be easily overcome by the use of aphorism or whatever. I think when you lose presence and when you bring into it the sterility, the immunity from contact with other people. This is all stuff that hopefully we'll get to a little bit later. But I think that this idea of neutral media in a social media age is incredibly problematic. And I want to get to that in a second. But first, let me just, these are two
and my
things
claim is not that it's neutral by saying that even Twitter could be used. It's more that, if you think of ancient biography, so there were other biographies before the gospel, and the biography is a celebration of the great man. It documents his pedigree, his great achievements, his victories, and so on. And if you read something like the Gospel of Mark, this record of an apparently so fragile and fleeting life that no one until the end except the soldier even recognizes why it was significant at all. I know the gospel's not exactly biography, but it's a sanctification of, like, the whole idea of what it means to have a life is changed by the writing of that gospel. So that's more my claim. Not that any genre is neutral, but that any genre, insofar as it's part of God's creation, there's no particular way of writing that couldn't be sanctified, no particular medium that could not somehow become drawn up into the drama of the gospel.
Let me just pick you up, though, on the issue of, part and parcel of the business of theology is trying to wrestle with words.
Yeah.
Because, again, one of the things that strikes me is that along with this idea that speech is simply free expression, I love the phrase that you used, that speech is simply me trying to imprint my emotions upon you. One of the other essential ideas, it seems to me, of Christian theology is that speech is already limited in advance because we are given a series of words and a series of concepts with which we must reckon. Already speech has a kind of constraint on it from the inside. There are things that we cannot say. There are things that no matter how hard you try to say it, you're always coming up against the limits of that. In other words, there's a vocabulary, there's a vernacular, there's even a dogma with which you must strain and wrestle.
Do you mean Scripture most of all? Is that what you mean?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
That these
so
things,
not constraints, but the conditions within which you're going to...
which are in fact constraints.
Yes.
I mean, this is the chastening of language. These are bridles.
Constraints the way loving a person is
Absolutely.
a constraint. It's the very form in which you're going to express your freedom.
Yes. Which means that there are always constraints, if you like, from behind and in front of us in terms of what we can say and how we should say it. Let me put this to you, for instance. One of the things that I've been thinking about quite a lot lately is the nature of disagreement. Here's my thesis. My thesis is that we've lost the capacity to disagree. Not because we can't disagree or that we don't disagree, but that what goes for disagreements today would have been historically, philosophically, intellectually unrecognizable as disagreements in the past. So, for instance, at the moment, we don't have disagreements, we just have fighting. The point of disagreeing now isn't to persuade, but rather to win. If you just watch something like Q&A, you cannot tell me that a genre like that has the purpose of persuading the audience. Instead, you've got caricatures lined up on the panel, and the point of that panel is to appeal to the tribe of the already convinced. So that persuasion has been substituted for simply staking one's flag in the ground, saying, this is what I stand for, who's with me? Now that's not disagreement. That's cockfighting, for want of a better term. Disagreement, what are the conditions of disagreement? Disagreement is predicated on the idea that there's something that we share that goes before us. That beneath our disagreement, there's something that binds us to one another. That might be a shared language. I mean, if you don't speak the same language, then you can't disagree with one another, quite simply. But I also think there's a shared kind of vernacular. There's a shared moral vernacular where there is a mutual commitment to one another that undergirds this disagreement. But I think the other thing is, if that's kind of what lies behind us, then what lies before us is our future must be part of one another's future. In other words, the end of disagreement isn't winning. The end of disagreement is conciliation. And if I can't imagine my enemy...
What do you mean by conciliation?
That's the rub. No, I think that's exactly the rub. Because,
I don't want to interrupt the train of thought. But
well, no, because if the point is winning, then I can use whatever language I want, whatever mode of argument I want, in order to bludgeon you into submission. But if there are things that I can say in the course of our disagreement that disrupt, that ruin, that betray our friendship, then that disagreement was never disagreement in the first place. In other words, you can't win an argument by betraying the person that you're arguing. And so when speech becomes particularly violent, when it trades in stereotype and slur, when it tries to bludgeon by means of tactic or rhetorical ploy, then you are sacrificing the relationship in the favor of winning an argument. So what that conciliation might be isn't that we finally achieved some point of agreement, but that even in our disagreement, you are still part of my world. That the world that I see is already inflected by the way that you see the world. Now that means that disagreements can take place over a long period of time. If you think about the way in which public debate is carried out today, it's not disagreement, because the whole point is to marshal each other into competing tribes and then wipe the face of the earth of that other group of people, either in print or, whatever. And so I think that one of the things that genuine theology and the notion of constraints that we inherit, which are constraints of friendship and community, which are constraints of history, but also constraints of theological language, these are all the things that need to be brought to bear constantly in the way that we speak, in the way that we write, so that, quite frankly, you can never say what you simply want to say. That saying, that act of experimentation is always chastened in advance by commitment to that tradition, by commitment to the other person, and by hopefully commitment to final conciliation.
And of course, I think this is a very helpful sort of analysis of one of the things that's so disordered in the media that we consume today. The way I disagree with the idea that let's say that the aim is ultimately to bludgeon the other person into submission, wipe them off the face of the earth. I doubt that that's what's in view. It's more that one of the things we're doing. So if I'm basically left wing and agree with all the usual line of left wing ideas, by consuming my left wing media, going to those writers who will always mirror back to me the things that I already knew and the things that I already took for granted. If I was to pay for, let's say, the magazines and newspapers and websites that are going to do that, one of the things I'm paying for is for that consoling feeling of belonging. This is my tribe. These are my people. It actually has, I think it has even less disagreement than the sort of conflict model where we would ultimately like to be the only voice. It's irrelevant what anyone else thinks. This is my tribe. These are my people. They're writing this ultimately for me. Even if it's like in a North American right-wing paper that is attacking some kind of scathing attack on Hillary Clinton, it's not written for her people, for her tribe. It's written for the Republican tribe. That's one of the ways in which I feel myself connected to something beyond myself, and so the media is giving me not one side of an argument, not one side of a disagreement, but feelings of belonging, feelings of identification.
I agree.
But I was going to go.
I would add one qualification to that, though. Yeah. Yes, I think a great deal of political commentary today, and even the kind of political performance artists. I mean, that really is what someone like Andrew Bolt is, right? I mean, they're political performance artists. The point isn't to convey morally relevant information. The point is to kind of gather a particular emotion, then hand it back to people as, being truly theirs. The left has plenty of political performance artists too. But I think one of the unique things, say, in the last decade and a half, that I think has had an immensely corrupting effect has been the emergence of, if you like, news satire. If you think about what news satire does as the opposite of something, of what, say, Rush Limbaugh or Sean Hannity or Andrew Bolt does, the purpose of that satire isn't just to give this kind of sneering, cynical take on the world and help you laugh at, all sorts of inappropriate things. The point of it is to make you feel so much smarter than those idiots who are on the other side. It's this sneering, condescending, quasi-progressive tone that flows through, like acid through this kind of satirical look at the world that's witheringly disdainful, whose sole purpose is to make not just us feel belonging, but to help us feel superior. And there was a beautiful piece in the Tablet newspaper, a Jewish publication in the UK last week, on why the whole cult of satire. You know, Colbert, what's the name of the guy? Jon Stewart, yeah. That whole cult of media satire paved the way for the rise of Donald Trump, because it evacuated from our public space the ability to listen, the ability to understand, the ability to see people on the other side of the aisles as something more than just, you know, hillbilly bogans who have some sort of middle-class white grudge or something. But to actually hear other people and to see them in a way that is other than simply inferior to where we are. So that's where I think the whole tribal, who's with me, I think that's where it turns into something really ugly, which is who's with me and aren't you glad you're so much better than the other side?
I don't know if I can agree with that pessimistic take on, certainly some of the satire, yes, can be utterly cynical and partisan. I was, full confession, watched an episode of Mad as Hell last night, is that, so I could be wrong, and even Stephen Colbert on the old one, the Colbert Report, it doesn't always, it feels like it's a satire of whatever happens to be newsworthy that week, but not a partisan one in the way you're describing. And don't forget, there's another, so even if it's true, yes, of course satire can foster, any type of irony can foster feelings of superiority and not just superiority, but detachment as well, which are not necessarily virtuous things to feed oneself on. Don't forget, though, one of the sort of ancient functions of comedy and of satire was its capacity to tell the truth. That's right. That there are social and communal truths that we can't hear, that will be either so counterintuitive that we'll screen them out, or just so difficult that we'll never be able to put them into words. And comedy has always been thought to have this extraordinary power to make a person change their mind, or at least open their mind, simply as they fall over laughing. You know, so maybe I'm splitting hairs, but I would blame the satirists less than the partisan nature of news media itself. But to go back to the earlier thing about friendship, this is where I think online communities can be a real breath of fresh air and a little, I don't know, an online community. I don't necessarily even mean Christian. Economists gather around economics blogs. There are blogs on jurisprudence and their little communities of readers, and it can be an oasis of sanity where people are actually trying to think together, to listen to what one another is saying. They are not trying to form a party or to the difference, I think, or one of the differences as well, is whether St. Augustine once, quoting a more ancient than himself author, said that any society is just it's a group of people held together by some common object of love. Otherwise, you've got a crowd, just a rabble of people. But if you've got a group of people and they all agree to love something, the same thing, now you've got a community, a society, a city, whatever you want to call it. And that's one difference. If it's a crowd who are consuming this sort of anonymous crowd that the news is being tailored for, I think that's quite a different context from let's say, a community of economists who they're not actually talking and thinking about themselves, but about some other thing. Or in Christian circles, if the thing we're talking about is God's way in our lives through Jesus Christ, that is, that's an object beyond ourselves, outside ourselves. Again, it's why self-expression becomes irrelevant, because I'm not trying to understand me as if that were the object. I want to understand God's way in human life in Jesus Christ. And that gives me a different task and a different way of trying to use language to talk about something that is beyond myself. And it's why, if there's this common object of love, it's why I can have meaningful disagreement. Because, for example, if I just express my feelings, well, of course, there's no human way that you could disagree with that. To do so would be what we now would call, it would be either discrimination. I can't think of quite the right word. Some kind of act of violence against my identity from which I need to be protected. It'd be harassment, or I don't know what I can't think of the right word. You see, struggling with words. I can't think of the right one. It would be some kind of assault on me as a person if I expressed my feelings and you didn't like it. What's that? Maybe I don't. All these. Every time I mention one, I realize, no, it has a particular legal meaning, and I don't mean that. But as opposed to, if I'm trying to talk about something that's not in here, but actually out there, let's say if it's economics, that's a thing, that exists, that is worthy of attention. It's possible to think well about it or poorly about it. And so if I make a case about that thing, if I use language to try to say something about it, now, if we both agree that that thing is worthy of attention, now it's possible to have a disagreement. Now it's possible for me to change my mind in response to something you've said because we're not talking about ourselves, because it's not our identity that's at stake, it's economic realities. And so this is where I think friendship is important, but it's an accidental byproduct. I wouldn't say the aim is friendship. Like Scott, we really want to be able to we really want to discuss the economy, but beforehand, to make sure we will be able to do the thing you were saying, disagree in a way that leads to conciliation. First, we must foster our friendship, so we'll go to SeaWorld together and spend a day drinking milkshakes and showing family photos. It's not that. Friendship is what happens accidentally when both of us are attending to the same object with affection. We both... And for me, I mean, going back to the original thing about why I think blogging is valuable, for me that's what's happened. Not that I went online trying to make friends, but that other people were also interested in the same questions. Other people were also devoting their attention to the same things. And you find yourself bumping shoulders with people who you didn't even notice were there, and you find yourself sharing a world with them and becoming friends. Not because C.S. Lewis has a lovely passage where he says the lovers, in erotic love, you look like this, straight at each other. The friends are always shoulder to shoulder looking at some common thing. And I think,
And I actually think that this is one of the things that is most often misunderstood about moral disagreement, that the moral disagreement is about the moral disagreement. And it's also the same thing that's often misunderstood about, say, interreligious or interfaith dialogue, that the point is actually the dialogue itself. I mean, doing this program now in various forms for some years with Waleed Ali has really been quite something for me. I mean, we disagree on an unimaginable range of topics. We are informed by very, very different both theological and philosophical traditions. We've never tried to give any attendance, if you like, to the friendship itself, but have discovered by pursuing something in common, by trying to get our minds and our hearts and our words around something that we're trying to talk about intelligently, or working on common projects together, by attending to something in common, you end up discovering things in the other person and about the other person you never could have discovered by simply trying to negotiate the interreligious dialogue or the moral disagreement.
Much less by saying, Waleed, express yourself. I want to know more about you. Like, expressing yourself is a dry and pointless and vapid.
Look, I really do want us to get on to, because this isn't just about us. One of the things about me and Ben, I think I've never quite been able to pick if you're basically a pessimist or basically an optimist. But which is good, because I've never been able to pick whether I'm basically a pessimist or basically an optimist either. I think when it comes to the media,
I can tell you the answer for me.
Really?
I think I could tell you the answer for you too, but that wouldn't be fair. But my theory, my understanding of the world, is very pessimistic. My understanding of human nature is a pessimistic one, but my temperament is optimistic. Wow. And so for me, this has been the way I mean, it's just personal. I know other people can be completely different, but for me, this knowing that about myself helps. Now I'm expressing myself, but is a way of dealing with what it means to be a Christian in a fallen world, to have both a kind of realistic, wide eyes open assessment of what this world is, and not just this world outside, but what I am as a human being. Not put on this earth as the solution, but born into this world as part of the problem that the human race suffers from. And yet to feel, to be honest, every person, even if I've ever met really wicked people, I always end up liking them. I always feel that there's more good in anybody than bad. It's always hard to imagine anyone being worthy of hell, or you know what I mean, or not wishing they had been born. So that's just my answer. This could be wrong, but I'm sure working in the media as an occupation has not helped you to become more optimistic. But I would have thought maybe you've got more of the pessimistic temperament. Maybe this is a horrible thing to say, and maybe more of the pessimistic theory.
No. Okay, wonderful. Thank you. No, I have an absolute pessimistic temperament. I basically don't like people. Yeah. I mean, I've...
Present company.
No, present company absolutely included. I basically do not like people. There are a handful of people in this world that I would say I genuinely love. But one of the things that being immersed in this cesspool...
And they're all in this room. I just want to...
one of the things that being immersed in this cesspool of the media has done for me is it's made me committed almost as a moral duty to being more optimistic about the world and being more idealistic in terms of one's ethical commitments.
See, I work for the church, and one of the things that is on for me, honestly, you wouldn't meet, present company accepted, you wouldn't meet a more sentimental, well-meaning but unrealistic community. It's wonderful. It's one of the things that is wonderful about the church, but it's not always productive in terms of real-world effects of that. If we're not actually taking the society we live in seriously for what it is, for example, if we're not really taking one another seriously for what we are, which is not just the image of God, but a pretty damaged and wonky image. So working for the church, a noble and wonderful community that lives by the virtue and the life of the Holy Spirit, has made me commit myself morally to a more rigorous pessimism. Because for the same inverse sort of reason. I think.
Because one of the things that I think the media suffers from, unlike the church, is it suffers from an inflated sense of its own importance and a diminished sense of its own responsibility. So that once the media blows its stack over X, it reports, it points the finger, and then it moves on. This is what was famously described by a British lord in, I can't remember his name, but I can remember it was 1936. It's cited several times. It tells you all sorts of things. I don't like people, so I can't remember names. Honestly, I just... one of the British lords...
But it was just a few years before the war.
Yeah, that's true. One of the British lords very, very famously referred to the media as being in the grip of the harlot's prerogative, which is all power and no responsibility. And for me, one of the problems with the media is that it believes that cynicism is a kind of moral duty, that cynicism is almost a journalistic virtue. One is, it's like C.S. Lewis's dwarves in The Last Battle. They're so terrified of being taken in, they're afraid to be let out. So many journalists are terrified of being caught believing in anything.
Yeah. But isn't that, this relates to the partisan tendency we were talking about before. If cynicism is the only way to avoid that type of slavish partisanship, I'm absolutely, if cynicism is the alternative to being a card-carrying member of some particular tribe, then maybe it is a moral improvement, but the destructive thing was setting up the game where you get to choose?
Yeah. Look, yes and no. Yes and no. I mean, I think one of the things that very, very early on political journalism understood about itself is that the role of, let's call it the role of public service media that isn't in, say, corporate interests, but the media who tries to report on things that are of common interest, that are of common importance. Surprisingly early on, one of the ideas was, and this would be the case right up to, say, about 1967, the understanding of many political journalists was that their fundamental responsibility was to serve democracy. Their fundamental responsibility was to nurture the conditions in which citizens could be connected to one another, in which citizens would be able to hear morally relevant information. I mean, this is all, if you read someone like Henry Fairley, a great, magnificent expat British Fleet Street journalist who came to live in Washington, D.C. from 1963 to about 1972, and was mortified by the idea that the media had stopped conveying, had renounced its commitment to giving the electorate morally relevant information. That was his phrase, morally relevant information, and instead believed that its sole responsibility was to point fingers, was to expose scandal, was to scrutinize politicians, was to hold them to account for their failures. In other words, instead of, talking about common objects again, instead of the media and democratically elected politicians pursuing the same ends, though by different means, instead the media turned itself into a democratic counterpower. Its whole role became not nurturing faith in democratic life, nurturing optimism in our capacity to achieve things that are good together, doing the sorts of things that you would have seen if you've seen the film Good Night and Good Luck, Edward Morrow. I mean, if you just remember, for instance, one of his most famous anti-McCarthy broadcasts from 1954. You remember at the end, instead of simply pointing the finger at corrupt politicians and tyrannical demagogues, remember his famous, "The fault, dear Brutus, lies not in our stars, but in ourselves." McCarthy didn't create this situation, he said. It was already here. He merely exploited it. Whose fault is that? Not really his. So this act, this moral imperative within political journalism to hold the people themselves to account, to their own ideals, to their common commitments to one another, to hold them to account in the face of their shared history and their professed sense of morality. That was explicitly, overtly, willfully renounced when the role of political journalists became to simply scrutinize the bastards and to show the people where they were wrong. Now, it's in those conditions that it's not, the cynical view of the world isn't a nurturing one. The cynical view of the world, the whole point of it is to destroy faith in the possibility of people to achieve things that are good and are not necessarily purely in one's self-interest. So again, just to give a very, very simple example, by 1978, the whole fabric of political reporting had changed entirely. No longer did you hear about President Jimmy Carter going to a particular electorate, trying to sort of encourage and trying to sell some reforms that he was making because he thought it was going to be better for the national life or whatever. Suddenly, the nature of political reporting was Jimmy Carter is in a swing state today, trying to garner the crucial vote among the X demographic. In other words, the role of political reporting was to pop the hood on the political engine, to show all the grubby, grimy inner workings, to try to demonstrate that politicians don't really have your interests at heart, but are simply trying to gain electoral advantage. And for someone like Henry Fairley, the effect of that was to empty anything like faith in the capacity of politics to serve something like a common good evaporated. And with that, there was nothing to oppose, simply economic interests. And so I think for me, one of the real problems with journalism today is it has no sense of responsibility in the sense of kind of nurturing our common life, trying to stoke possibilities of optimism and hope. The whole purpose is to critique. The whole purpose is to find our own gate. The whole purpose is to try to claim a certain scalp. Then once that's gotten, then you move on. And for me, that is a completely destructive way of seeing other human beings and a completely destructive way of nurturing our common life.
Wouldn't you say, though, So unless, if we're trying to think about how that could be better, even if that's true, and even if the media has a higher moral vocation, which is a wonderful thing to think about, how could this improve? Would you suggest that there is some kind of is there some kind of moral authority that the media ought to be accountable to? Is there going to be a kind of in other words, will there be somebody who gets to decide what's the morally relevant information? Or will you have to allow it to emerge in the kind of competitive media market that we have, where when an even earlier writer about the newspapers in America, when Tocqueville went to America and observed the amazing freedom of the press, and he writes about it in his book on democracy, and marveled at the way newspaper reporting had grown up from the very roots of American democracy, and he thought that this was wonderful because it made possible a free society, because of the fact that opinions, precisely what counts as morally relevant, is up for grabs and will have to be a subject of debate and discussion, and there will be different points of view. And he said the only alternative to a free press like that, a free competitive marketplace of ideas, the only alternative would be some form of European tyranny. He went on, though, to analyse all of the things that are so harmful and destructive when you have a free press, such as the things we've been talking about tonight. It will always, and very quickly, it had already degenerated into partisanship, into scoring points and trying to bring down the local candidate. Already, there was a kind of chaos and anarchy about it, which he did not think was good. But he thought, taken as a whole system, it is far superior to tyranny or to any centralized body deciding this is what will be morally relevant for this population. So I guess I share the. You see, I told you I was more of a pessimist in my worldview. I guess I would share the criticism, but I wonder if these problems we're talking about might just be part of, collateral damage that you have to live with in order to have a free society where people can think for themselves, or ideally not think for themselves, but engage in free argument about what will be morally relevant, about what the goods of the nation are. And, just a more optimistic note, of course there are, within the media, there are places that do this. There are entire publications that are committed to doing this. There are journalists who are committed to doing this. And we talked about blogs. That's one of the ways this happens as well. So to the extent that there are, Elijah's not the only faithful one left. So I wonder if I try and imagine what the media would be like in a much, much better society than the one we live in, sometimes I end up thinking, well, it would probably have to be more or less the same. Otherwise, you would risk making your society much worse if it meant some kind of imposition of... So am I wrong about that? How do you
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
And there, the great wedge between us has suddenly emerged. Look, let me respond to this. Then I want to move us on to the last topic that we will discuss, and then let's open it up for conversation. Look, with all respect to Monsieur de Tocqueville, he was right in thinking that the press is a form of civic association. And in fact, he saw that one of the important things about the press is that it began to overcome the constraints of space. That because people were simply more distended than in the provincial system in France and the parish system in Britain, because people were more distended and spread, they needed other things to hold them together. Because they didn't have physical bonds, they needed another type of bond, and that the press could potentially provide that kind of thing. The problem for Monsieur de Tocqueville is that the popular press in the United States was already from the very beginning subject to party political concerns. I mean, they were party political rags, trying to whip. It wasn't informing.
That's what he's talking about.
Yeah. So it was how to hold the party together, or people who belong to a particular political orientation together. So it wasn't really in the interests of civil society. It was in the interests of this particular political or ideological alignment. I would suggest, Ben, that the better analogy would be someone like John Stuart Mill, or even like Jean-Jacques Rousseau. For both Mill and Rousseau, they had the same idea of the popular press as trying to overcome the constraints of space. When all the people aren't living in the one space and can't hear one another's voices, how do you allow humanity to incline their ears one to another? And this was John Stuart Mill's beautiful description. He says, what the newspaper does is it lets one group of people in one province to hear the humanity and the concerns, to feel the heart of people in another province. And when they discern the humanity elsewhere, they find a commonality, they find a common humanity, and then they're able to gather that common humanity together and to convey that voice clearly to their elected representatives.
So just to
I mean, there are all sorts of problems with that.
Was he describing actually existing newspapers? Or
Yes,
what
absolutely.
He thought they could, in principle...
No, for him, this was the actual political function. But you see, again, that's on the assumption that the primary organ of political agency within a democracy is the voice. That we need to hear what one another says, then we need to communicate our voice to our political representatives. One of the things that's happened over the last 3 decades is that the primary organ of political agency has gone from voice to the eyes. We now scrutinize. We now stare. We now want to expose. We now want transparency. Most people living today have completely ignored the seismic consequences of the shift from clear communication one to another and clear communication to our elected representatives. And instead, it's been replaced by always finding fault, always scrutinizing, always wanting to limit. So much so that you can't say that elections now convey a mandate to elected representatives. What elections do is they constrain. Elections don't empower officials. They tell them, this is what we don't want you to do. It's what this wonderful political theorist Pierre-Rosan Vallon calls negative sovereignty. That's what people operate on today. It's like a parish council or a church council. Tell me I'm wrong. Isn't the role of a church council to constrain what the minister can and cannot do instead of... See, this is the pessimist. Anyway, suddenly I lost the crowd. What happened? But look, I do think, though... I'll stand by that. I do think, though, that one of the things that we have missed in this idea of what the press is, or what the press is trying to do, is that its original goal was, in fact, to bring people together, to empower the public, to be able to exercise a certain will on political life. I mean, as soon as that begins to devolve, and it becomes about serving either particular interests, or even it becomes just about conveying knowledge to individual people, I think there are all sorts of things about the original purpose that gets...
Conveying knowledge would be wonderful. I mean, that, and if in my thought experiment of what would the media be like in a better version of our society, one thing that I do think could be better would be more reliance on words and a lot less reliance on images, because communication of knowledge is crucial. It's crucial if people are going to make informed decisions. But the increasing substitution of images, presumably it's thought to be an even quicker and more potent way of achieving the same desired effect.
Everything you need to know about what's going on in Syria is in this one image.
In an image. Yeah. And what the image does, it's like the way I described self-expression. It's an attempt to trigger an immediate automatic emotional response without placing that image or that response within some kind of context, without necessarily giving you a narrative to think about it. And this means that there's a real danger then that both that people consuming, that when we consume these images, that we think somehow that we're responding morally, when in fact all we're doing is having an emotional, a predictable, the same triggered response everyone else who saw the image had. And because we haven't been invited to tell a story about that image, to put it in a context and think about it, the first narrative that is handed to us seems self-evidently true. You could see this, can I use an example? You could see this with, I think recently, the incredibly confronting and harrowing images out of Dondale, where these were presented as if the image told the whole story. And straight away, within hours in the media, there is all this talk about systemic racism, the historical wrongs that have created these problems, the pressure on politicians to address this, so we've got a royal commission now. And so a narrative that was not actually present in that program. What the program gave you were images that were shocking and almost unwatchably awful. And you were meant to just infer what all this meant. And Warren Mundine wrote a powerful piece in the Financial Review the next weekend, saying the whole narrative that's being constructed about these will probably make life much worse for these damaged communities that have been so damaged by, not by historical wrongs, but by bad policies that are trying to assuage our sense of national guilt. And what are we doing now? Well, let's have a royal commission. We've got to deal somehow with our national guilt. So he, in about 600 words, gave a quite different narrative. Not that takes away the terrible horror of what was going on, but that had a different way of thinking about what that might mean and what it might mean to respond morally to that. The image can be politically dangerous, and I think it can be morally dangerous for us if we think that every time we feel strongly in response to a media that somehow we are now having a moral reaction. And so what you see in social media, for example, is this simple three-step process. Graphic image, and the world's a bad enough place that there will be a daily supply from now until when Christ returns. Definitely, there will always be a supply. So a disturbing, confronting image, an immediate emotional response, as if someone had flipped a switch, and I just respond to it. And then, how am I going to deal now with these feelings that have been stirred in me? So you get on things like Twitter and Facebook the expression of moral outrage. And then, what do I do now? So now I've tweeted a hashtag thing, and I've said, I see, this is nothing personal about ministers, but sometimes when ministers say, they make almost like a public statesman-like statement on Facebook. I just want to know, I really stand by such and such, or I am against. Is that, the effect of all this, I think, is that instead of being able to reflect morally on the world that we live in, and on when something happens in the world, if that imposes some kind of responsibility on me, that will always mean a responsibility to act in some way. But if I submit myself to an avalanche of these emotional stimuli, then the way I can feel, the substitute for moral action can be words of outrage, expressions of indignation, banding together with other outraged people, signing a petition, being against this or that, maybe donating some money, something that makes me now feel like I've dealt with it, I've done something, I have not done something, I have not acted. In fact, it's the three-step process, and it will be repeated tomorrow. It's automated. And words cannot produce, words of course can be used for propaganda and something, but they do not have that same power to automatically trigger emotion in the way that images do. So that's one thing that could be better.
I think one of the things that's incredibly complicated then about that is when we have stories like Dondale, which aren't new stories, but have in fact been reported since March last year, but gained exactly zero attention, precisely because there weren't images to go along with it. And for me, the rule of thumb is always that of Susan Sontag. She wrote this wonderful, wonderful book in 1977 on photography. It's called On Photography. And she says that images are ethically fragile things. They whip up emotion, but they can't sustain emotion. And it's really interesting to me that she then goes on to show that an image that whipped up a certain amount of emotion today won't have the same effect on me in a week's time, which is why you then have to have an even more extreme or a more realistic or a more confronting version later on. Now, what it then means is that almost the entirety of our ethical sense of the world becomes dependent upon being confronted with certain degrees of brutality, monstrosity, and horror. There was a very interesting, but to my mind, incredibly problematic debate that was being held among many journalists at the beginning of last year. And it went something along the lines of, there are unspeakable atrocities going on in Gaza at the moment. There are unspeakable atrocities taking place in Syria. Do we need to lift the traditional restrictions off the media in terms of what is polite to print in terms of images? In other words, do images now need to be even more graphic than they were before in order to garner enough international support and whatever? I mean, to me, the first ethical question is, why on earth does it take an image to deliver us to a point where sheer description cannot? I don't know if any of you have read through any of the incident reports that have come out of Nauru over the courtesy of The Guardian, which have just done a spectacular job over the last week. Those reports themselves make for extremely difficult reading. The most confronting of those incident reports, however, aren't the ones that describe, say, brutality of a guard against a little girl or an instance of possible sexual assault. For me, some of the most awful, awful, awful reports are those where a parent is trying desperately to get the attention of one of the guards, saying that she believes that one of the other children in the camp may have contracted tuberculosis, and she's terrified that her child might catch it. For me, that's a feeling that every parent in this room would be.
So a non-photographable moment. Is that what
non-photographable, but and it will never make a list of the questions that Lee Sales will put to Peter Dutton in terms of horrible responses. And yet, for me, there is something about the normality of that, about the sheer humanity of that speaks to every person in this room. What's then horrific about this isn't the incident report, that it's of a particular graphic nature, but that what is on display here is a parent who wants the best for her child and has been stripped of agency, has been stripped of the capacity to do anything in this world about it. Now, it's the fact that the media, because of its salaciousness, because of its dependence on the horror, on the display, on the viscera, because of its dependence on graphicness, it means that we simply lose the capacity to feel, to recognize, to sense that which is most purely, sublimely, serenely human.
Of course, the connection between image and emotion is understandable. That's innate. It's. I don't think that is a kind of manufactured problem. It's tapping into something instinctive.
It is identification. I can imagine being in that situation.
Yeah. Adam Smith wrote a book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments about these extraordinary, the way human beings are built to empathize and so that if I see someone grieving, it will make me feel, wonder what I would feel like in that place. If I see someone, I mentioned this at a talk here earlier today, when you see someone with tears welling up in their eyes, there'll always be a certain percentage of people who will cry. A yawn will stimulate yawns. So this visual, the visual stimulus of another human face and the way that triggers an emotional response is a profound and beautiful and important dimension of who we are, which is perfectly tapped into by this use of emotions to stimulate an automatic response. The problem's not with that sort of emotional mechanism, but with the fact that emotion is not the same. An emotional response is not a moral response to a given situation. In order to do that, if I see someone grieving, I'll need some kind of context. I'll need some kind of narrative. And if I'm not in the habit of wondering about that, I wonder what's going on. I wonder what the context is. If I'm in the habit of just an automatic response to stimuli, there will be someone else who will be willing to provide the narrative, which I haven't reflected on. And so you get all these, the way characters from war zones around the world, characters in famines, people in real life trauma get scripted into these typecast roles. This is the starving child. This is the grieving mother in a war-torn place. This is the terrorist. This is the redneck or whatever. So these faces come to take on all these meanings that we ourselves haven't been invited to reflect on. One of the things about emotional response as well is I think it can be changed. Although our emotional responses are automatic and inbuilt, they're not inflexible. So, for example, if I've grown up in an environment where I take certain racist ideas for granted, I assume that everyone from a certain part of the world is bad or barely even human. But then over time, if I befriend someone who happens to be from that part of the world, my understanding, my judgment, my reasoning, my thinking about that part of the world will change because of this one person. And when I now see images that used to provoke a certain emotional response, my emotional responses can be converted. They can be changed. And I mention this only because I think one of the basic roles of the Christian community is to be a place of moral formation and a place where our emotional lives can come under the discipline of the gospel. That's what it means to begin to learn to love your neighbor as yourself, which involves emotion, to love God, which involves a certain disposition towards God, feeling a certain way towards God. It's possible for one's emotional responses undergo conversion, and so I don't mean that the church is competing against the media, but there is some kind of element of competition where it is in somebody's interest for me to react in the same old way every time I see a certain type of image.
I think there's slightly more competition than you realize, though, because one of the things that the media in general and social media in particular trades on, the media, this may be in bad taste, the media provides a kind of ethical prophylactic in its dealings with the world. It will arouse emotions because of whatever's going on someplace else. But then it keeps you in a position of relative immunity. You don't have to be made dirty by that. You don't have to be infected. You don't have to be made responsible by what's going on elsewhere. You can have your emotions aroused, but without consequence. And I think here's where the Christian tradition is entirely different. To put it in an incredibly crass way, you cannot love your neighbor unless you can smell your neighbor. Yes, you can read an incredibly heartwarming story in Mamma Mia. You can log on to Humans of New York. You can be aroused by these heartwarming stories. But you cannot call that, by any stretch of the imagination, moral love or political love or love for one's neighbor, unless somehow the story has ushered you into someone else's presence, unless somehow you have been inconvenienced, unless somehow you have been made dirty by your communion, by your contact with this other person. And so for me, there are very, very, very few things that I think the media can claim to do that are genuinely moral acts in and of themselves. The information that's provided isn't moral. until it brings you close to somebody else. And I think any good storytelling, any good image has got to usher you into the presence of that other person to do something as a result. I've got one very wee last question, and then let's throw it open. I think we have too much information. I think the media reports on too much. I think we feel an obligation to know too much. We are, historically speaking, theologically speaking, the first generation not to wrestle with the moral problem of what to do with what we know. From Søren Kierkegaard right through to Hannah Arendt, through to Iris Murdoch, through to Ivan Illich, so many of these great Christian or Christianly affected thinkers, W.H. Auden as well, have worried about the laziness, about the moral irresponsibility that goes on with having too much knowledge and thinking that possessing that knowledge is a moral act in and of itself. I, as my parting sort of idea for the evening, and then you'll respond, and then we'll, I think we have the same obligation as Sherlock Holmes, who deliberately knew nothing about the nature of the solar system and that the Earth revolves around the sun, because he said that having that knowledge would do absolutely nothing for the task at hand. It would do nothing for the way that he lives in the world. He deliberately doesn't know things so that which he knows he can act upon. It's remarkable to me how many serious thinkers have come to the same conclusion, that our knowledge has to be in a constant dynamic relationship with what we are then responsible for and what we can then do. One of the problems in an ill-disciplined, flabby, flatulent social media age is that we think that just knowing more and more stuff, moving on to the next and next and next and next and next story, is somehow expanding our moral horizons. Whereas for W.H. Auden, that is moral laziness. The refusal to close the newspaper and to act on what I have read is moral laziness. And for me, one of the great Christian disciplines is to bring back the idea of something like a kind of intellectual fast. There comes a point where you just stop reading. You don't need to know what is going on in X until you do something about what you've already read. For me, this is something we never talk about, and yet the logic of the Christian faith, it seems to me, kind of urges that.
Not just a fast either. I was just thinking of, I think it's also Auden who contrasts reading a few things well with reading a lot of everything across the surface. And when you think of Psalm 1, that wonderful vision of the righteous, blessed life. And it's a life that is planted by the water, putting down its roots deep. Why? What's that an image of? His delight is in the law of the Lord, and on that law he meditates day and night. It's the life of reading. Psalm 1 is about the life of a reader, planted in one place with roots that just go deeper every year, drawing up nourishment from the same source year after year after year. And that's what gives stability, that's what gives depth to a life. So alongside, I like your idea of the fast, but I wouldn't want to see that as an absence. In fact, as fasting is understood in the Christian tradition, as an opportunity for intensified reflection, intensified contemplation. Not the time when you let's say fasting from food, not that that's when you don't feed, but that's when you feed deeply on the Word of God. So to think of, to me, the most important way of trying to, not to withdraw from the media, because that would mean a withdrawal from the world that we live in, not a withdrawal from news, because that would mean kind of breaking of solidarity with my society. But a principled decision that the things that shape my life, the things that tell me who I am, the things that tell me where I belong, will come from a deep and constant reading and rereading of God's Word. that's where my roots will go. And to the extent that my life is planted deep in the scriptures, that my life is drawn from that place, that's what will give me the capacity morally to think about news, all the other news, and actually find a place within my horizons once those horizons have been marked out by the good news. So I like what you're saying. Less information. You called it less knowledge, but of course, strictly speaking, you remember Socrates who goes around trying to figure out what do you know, and the end of every conversation with Socrates, you realize, the thing that I thought was knowledge was just an opinion, utterly unfounded, not true at all, maybe useful to a degree, and Socrates is on this lifelong quest to find somebody in Athens who actually knows something, anything at all. That type of exercise, it's not just that we know too much. A life planted by the streams of water, meditating on the law of the Lord day and night, that's a life that knows something, knows one big thing, and that gives you a way of sifting and interpreting, making sense of, and yes, responding to the many, many opinions that come crashing in over us like waves. So less opinion, more knowledge of God, so that you can do something with the opinions.
I'd buy that. Thank you. Do you need to? Great. There aren't any microphones or anything, are there? No, people are just going to use their fabulous. Any questions that you'd like to? If not, we can just keep talking. I mean, I've got. Yeah.
I don't think. Can I go first?
Yep,
I don't think you have to. I don't think Christianity has to be the only game in town. I don't think Christianity has to be always making a case for how good it is. But having within any society, even a very small, fragile community of these people with a common object of love who are just attending to reality by attending to God's work in Christ. Just the existence of those people means something to the society that's a part of. It matters in ways that nobody can measure or predict or understand. I don't think it has to be, this is not an attack on your question, I think it's a great question, but it doesn't have to be about commending these practices to everybody else, but actually trying, after all, isn't that our favorite, I speak as a baptized Christian, isn't that our favorite way as Christians of not doing? I'm going to try and get other people into contemplating the Word of God instead of contemplating the Word of God. So I think the presence of, you are the salt of the earth. A little bit of yeast leavens the whole lump. Nobody knows the difference it would make if there were not a Christian presence, if there were not somewhere in a society a group of people who are meditating on the law of the Lord day and night. So I would rather see it as a call to Christian disciples, and the proof is in the pudding. If anyone else thinks this is a good idea, it'll be by our fruits.
I'd have two wee things, maybe slightly more. I'm not sure I completely agree with you, but 99%. One thing.
What's the other 1%?
I'll let you know. One thing is I actually think we need to give people moral permission now not to have an opinion about everything. Because having an opinion has become a moral thing to do. That has not been the case until 1846. After 1846, this is according to Soren Kierkegaard in his diaries, after 1846, having an opinion about something became a moral thing to do. Now, I don't think we have to have opinions about everything. Just think about the pressure that you feel to be feverishly up with everything. So that somebody asks you after church or they come around for dinner, so have you heard about the latest out of... The pressure that we feel to be up with whatever is big in the news.
And the shame if you're not.
And the shame if you're
as
not.
If it were a moral act.
Absolutely. So, first of all, I think we have to have moral permission not to know and not to have an opinion. There are only a handful of things that you have a right, you have an obligation to have an opinion about. And those are the things that are then binding upon you to do something about. Now, that can be an expanding circle, but it's not that we have to have opinions about everything. I think that's incredibly important. Look, the other thing, which may seem incredibly strange to say, our language today is in an awful state of disrepair. Inside the pulpit and without, as Flannery O'Connor put it, verbal nihilism is the very air we breathe. We are terrible with our language. It's become, I think, incredibly sloppy. It's become willfully unbeautiful.
You said that so...
Is that a word? It's become willfully, but even more than that, it's become tainted by the stench of partisanship. You know, I mean, one of the novelists that I probably hate most in this world is Jonathan Franzen. He has this stupid idea from his, New York loft apartment as he gazes imperiously across the heartland of the United States, that people are basically Democrat and Republican all the way down. That even in their bedrooms, they talk like Democrats and Republicans. This man knows nothing about humanity and about real life, but as a typical imperious New Yorker, he thinks he does. Now, one of the problems with the way that Christians have come to speak in public is that we think that left and right goes all the way down. That all of our political language has to be refracted through the same thing. I mean, the first pope of the media age, John Paul II, in his very first encyclical, said that the church is not and cannot be the servant of one bloc or another, of one party or another. It is not a lobby group. It is not an agent of a political party. For the church to be the servant of the gospel, it must cut diagonally across the divide. And so much of our language has become so god-awful predictable. If there is anything that the church can bring back to the public square, it seems to me it's a chastened, willfully beautiful, deliberately surprising form of language. It's a language that is more inflected by the gospel than it is by ideological divides. It's a form of language that is more chastened, but it's also more willing to surprise and not simply be co-opted by one or another camp. And so for me, this is also part of the kind of determination not to know, the willful cutting oneself off from being slavishly kind of taken over by whatever is trending in the media cycle. It's recovering a form of language that is beautiful, that is elegant, and above all, that's willing to be surprising.
I like that. Sorry, we need another question. Just to say, I think instead of, or even better than beautiful and elegant, I think surprising is important. And in a strange way, I think the language of Scripture has again become, there were centuries in which that was the cliched way you would talk. If you're an English Puritan in the 17th century, it's really hard to quote Scripture without sounding like a cliche, because that's the public language. And in a strange way, the detachment of the language of our culture from Scripture means, again, when you look at some contemporary Christian writers who are just, opening windows, opening doors, and letting the light into humanity. Some who I've been reading recently, like Marilyn Robinson, Wendell Berry, wonderfully human and wise and widely loved and widely read authors. And it's precisely the language of Scripture that they're using, the oldest thing there is, but it seems fresh, it's surprising, and it can be used. So this is a challenge to the pulpit as well, where the language of of Scripture is still a cliche, the one little place where it can be, is how do you actually talk about and with Scripture in a way that surprises, in a way that is new, in a way that is alive, if possible.
Just a reflection on your comment about reflecting on the Word of God, putting down roots and drawing sustenance. It sounds to me very much like the sort of taking oneself or retreat that would be best seen or well seen anyway in the Ignatian spiritual exercise of using imagination as well as reflection. And on a daily basis, the daily examine at the end of the day, of your day, of the incidents that happen. That sort of thing is a very powerful tool.
And a great example of the fact that reading Scripture for Christians, when you think about what's going on in the Ignatian exercise, it's like this whole world. You're basing it on one phrase from the Gospel, and there's this entire architecture. It's cavernous, it's immense. You can go deep into the human psyche. How? By reading really, really well. There's a great, you know, in Simone Weil's discussion of this sort of, anyway, but Simone Weil, a mid-century French radical who didn't quite convert to Christianity, though she came to believe in Christ. Anyway, she has a little discussion of the Lord's Prayer where she says she has long adopted, this is her own invention. So people who attend to the real human labour, the moral labour of reading, of paying attention to something that's really there, that is not me, that transcends me, another voice that has spoken. Ignatian exercises it one way. Simone Weil says she had adopted the daily discipline of reciting the Lord's Prayer every day and trying to concentrate her entire attention on the words she was reciting. And every time she found that her concentration had lapsed, it's just a flicker, she would go back to the start and start saying it again. And that is grueling work. She was doing, this is why I say it's a moral act, she was doing something to herself. She was doing something to her mind, to her emotions, to her soul. And sometimes, she said, it took a long time to get to the end of the Lord's Prayer. Why? Because the mind has become disordered. It flickers around from one thing to the next. And so, he shall be like a tree planted.
Having conversations last week about how from generation to generation, it touched on some of the things we're talking on. Knowledge grows, technology grows, wisdom apparently not. What insights would you have to the church about wisdom growing across generations?
Someone here just said, listen to your elders. Look, believe it or not, I actually think that's got a huge, huge part to do with it. One of the things that has attended the growth in media culture, what I think is probably best referred to as a media-saturated age, is what C.S. Lewis referred to as chronological snobbery. Because it's now, it's better. I'm writing this book at the moment on whether the media is corrosive to the moral life. The answer is yes, by the way. But I'm not a pessimist. One of the striking things to me is that the critiques that you find of media from the end of the 18th century to the middle of the 20th century, almost to a person, were people who were from people who were profoundly inflected, who were profoundly affected, influenced by the Christian or the Jewish traditions. And the critiques that are raised at various points are in every conceivable way superior to the paltry examples of media criticism that we read today. There was an attentiveness, there was a moral seriousness that was being brought to bear on what was going on in public culture, on the way in which life and moral responsibility was being eroded all around, that in every way was superior to what we can bring to bear to public reflection today. And it seems to me that there's a kind of willful disdain of what has gone before, of thinkers, of historians, of public intellectuals, and there's a kind of smug complacency about, the latest fads that the media is able to turd up at the moment as somehow being incredibly sort of, impressive and with things and, up with the complexities at the moment. To me, one of the first responses really has to be a whole lot more groveling humility about what it is that we simply have no idea about what to do today, or the things that we've lost as part of our common life. That's not sort of romanticism or communitarianism or anything else, but I think it's proper, it's appropriate humility in the face of what we've lost for the time being. Can I say two quick things and then over to you? Firstly, the New York Times. There's an awful lot that they get wrong, especially, there's a particular thing called New York Times religion. Things are better than they used to be, but the reporting that the New York Times engages in, especially surrounding all things Catholicism, is remarkably wrong on all sorts of levels, precisely because they think that it's right. I think that's begun to change, but that's the bad thing about the New York Times. The incredible thing, I would urge all of you, if you want to get a sense of the sort of moral formation that ought to take place within newsrooms, there's a wonderful documentary called Page One. It's about the New York Times. It is magnificent. Page One, it will transform the way that you think about the moral responsibilities of journalists. It's a fly-on-the-wall documentary about a 2-year period in the life of the New York Times. It's magnificent. One of the things that strikes me about the Times is that it's one of the few places left, and I should say that the ABC has a very strong sense of this as well, of not just institutional loyalty, but institutional exceptionalism. That the world would be a worse place if this institution, if this company did not exist, and because of that, there's a particular moral obligation to make sure that what we do right. Some of the people that I've met within the ABC, this organization would grind to a halt if it wasn't for the sense of professional vocation that undergirds it. We are not paid for what we in fact do. The number of people that do double their usual hours, unpaid, because it's just what needs to be done in order to serve something that is good. There aren't many places where I've come across that particular work ethic. It's very much there in the New York Times as well, which is why the Times can create incredible things. Like, there's this extraordinary woman named Tina Rosenberg. She was the New York Times genocide and coup reporter for about a year. By the end of it, she just, I can't do this. This is one of the most lucrative shticks within modern media. And she just said, I can't do it. My way of looking at the world is getting unspeakably bleak. I cannot do this. And so instead, she was asked by her managing editor, what do you want to do? She said, all I've been doing is reporting problems. And her managing editor said, how about I start getting you reporting on solutions? And so they created for her this sub-site called The Fix. And it's about the good news stories that are the result of genuine community, grassroots organizing that are a result of genuine technological fixes, that are a result of genuine innovations within university or industry. I mean, to my mind, that's the sort of thing that an organization like that can do, that we ought to have so much more of. The remedy, the antidote of bad news isn't fluff. The antidote of bad news isn't kittens or Kardashians. The antidote of bad news is honest to God's solutions to things. Another dear friend of mine, the British, I don't know what he is, intellectual quasi-philosopher, Alain de Botton, he has this beautiful, beautiful thing where he says the media will never be a force for good in the world until front page on the Daily Mail is septuagenarian, maybe not septuagenarian, but septuagenarian actor resists multiple opportunities for extramarital affair and remains married to same wife for 40 years. I mean, it's that celebration of what can actually go well in the world that really great organizations like the Times can do. Just quickly on the whole issue of authority. Australia is less, we are well served by a tradition of public broadcasting, I think. There are pressures, there are huge pressures at the moment. I would suggest that the greatest pressure that's on our commitment to public broadcasting at the moment is not from government or government cuts, but it's immersion in the tyranny of the click and share economy. When news stories were carefully and easily distinguished from the advertising that paid for them, there's a kind of transparency there that's crucial. When news stories pay for themselves by their click and share ability, it imposes, in other words, how well they're going to do on Facebook and Twitter. That's not demonetized news. That's hyper-monetized news. It means that the only stories that are going to get a run are the stories that are going to be big on social media. Now, when a overtly commercial venture like Gawker or BuzzFeed does that and does well, it means that everybody else has to do the same thing, which is why the ABC then begins reporting on hashtags and what's trending on Facebook at the moment, or what's trending on Twitter, or whatever. It's the tyranny of a global click and share economy and the way that dictates that certain stories be told in certain ways and that effectively erases other stories. That, for me, is the greater threat than virtually any other constraint within the Australian media.
So would that mean that stories that would be unpopular on the click and share media would be written at all or published at all?
Partly, or it means that a perfectly fine story is going to get reported in a particular way. Look, I mean, have any of you ever read the metrics for how long people spend on an average news story? Like, it's 20 seconds or less is the average. So if a title to a perfectly good bit of reporting is skewed to the click and share economy, then all someone's going to get from that story is the title, and this has something to do with sexual abuse in the church. And it's bound to go crazy because it's going to have George Pell in it. But nothing else is going to matter. So for me, it's not just that stories won't be told, but they're also going to be papered over by a particular headline that lends itself to this kind of frenetic, superficial click and share economy. That for me is the more dangerous thing. And it just means that the church shouldn't be in the business of submitting itself to that same tyranny. It means that the church shouldn't constrain itself to simply writing for news sites or opinion pages. It also means that it's going to become incredibly important for the church, or apart from ABC Religion Ethics, which is like this oasis, and but it also means that the church really has to pay very, very, very careful attention to what on earth it's actually doing if it wants to begin going big in social media spaces. This is not a neutral zone. The click and share economy is worse than anything dreamed up by William Randolph Hearst. This is far worse than media moguls and barons this is the banality or the virality of evil.
And the picture that we started with of the way blogs and other, I don't just mean blogs, but it's an example of where you can simply have known to themselves, that they're not trying to commandeer a world, not trying to overtake the world or to go viral, but communities where it's already taken for granted that the people who read this blog will read what I have to say, which removes all of those constraints. Most of the good blogs are written by people who have a day job, so they're not writing for money, which takes away other constraints. And so the fact that these types of communities, not to be utopian about them, but that they do make possible another way of using language within community, which I think still has great promise. And so I guess this is just an optimistic note. It's not necessarily the role of, not all Christians will have the power to try and reform the way institutions go about economizing their news. But the fact that Christians can participate in other forms of media interactions is again a way of being a small but significant presence in the world.
Ben, can I just follow up? I think that ties into the question of authority. Because yes, we can say that, but at the end of the day, what is the authority that's established? From a Christian perspective, should we be rallying around the established taxi, companies, or is it grandma users and not worry about the next? It's that kind of, coming back to John's Hill about, I hear the voice of that person from the other side of the country, but who gets to tell me what that person is saying? And I think as a society there is an acknowledgement that there is an established authority that's saying that to some of these groups. So I'm just interested in all of your comments about the blogs, how you can hold that together.
I'll just say one very, believe it or not, very, very brief thing. Is that chuckle? That's rude. Put your watch down. It's true. The media operates by certainties. They won't have a guest on a show unless they already know what the guest is going to say. Which means that the sorts of guests that the media invite or the sorts of op-eds that they'll commission are effectively caricatures. It's a sure thing. Perfectly on display at Q&A. There's no room for spontaneity apart from shoe throwing. There's no room for spontaneity in that room, which provides a wonderful opportunity for the church. The temptation is to simply do what's expected, to say what we've been invited on to say. But one of the things that very, very well run, very well curated blogs do, and one of the things that inviting surprising guests onto programs does, is it overcomes or it panders to the media's other great temptation, which is the new and the salacious and the possibly controversial, which is just a long way of saying, I think the church's responsibility is to, like we said before, to discover these new ways of surprising in exactly those places and precisely those interview formats where a sure thing was expected. And because journalists are stupider than they've ever been, it's incredibly easy for guests to actually turn the conversation around. That's a ridiculous question. And what you really want to know is, and because so many journalists don't have a prior specialization, they've just been taught how to write headers and leaders and how to craft their thing. They've got no idea, and so they're waiting. They've been given a set of talking points by their editor. If the guest turns it around and takes the conversation in a direction they couldn't have imagined, that's brilliant copy. You'll then get all sorts of congratulations. Look, that was wonderful. We'll have you on again sometime. So I think there are all sorts of opportunities here that wouldn't have been possible in a more literate, more intelligent media age, if you'd believe that.
Thanks very much, Scott and Ben. Can everyone clap, give them a clap? Now, just in finishing up, there is a supper. I don't know what we call that. Up there. It's not how we're going to roll in the future. It's no one's fault, but it's not going to be. We're not going to throw out defrosted cakes in future at the Trinity Unplugged. But help yourself to what you can see up the back. The other thing, before I close, the other thing, a lot of you have given us your email address. If you could let us know at the front counter if you don't want that used by us, that would help. So I think most of you have ticked the little privacy thing when you've registered. But if you could let us know if you don't want to receive something, that would be good. We've also...
You mean sell our details to,
Yeah, that's right. We've had some photos taken from the back. If you don't want your image included, please let us know. All these things we've got to do these days. We're part of a Christian community here that you may not come from one of those, but we seek to become more Christ-like. So how about I pray for us in finishing? Father God, we thank you for your Spirit who accompanies your word, and we ask that he would be active in our lives, conforming us and making us more like your Son. We pray that he would also be with our words and form and shape them as we speak with others, and that he would help us understand the words that others speak to us, that we would understand and attend to what they say in love. Amen.